Hello, I'm Joshua Gordon of the Sports Conflict Institute. We are live with SCI TV. Today I'm joined by my very special friend and guest, Dr. Scott Brooks from the University of Missouri. Welcome, Scott.
Thanks, Josh. Great to be here.
So you and I have had a chance to chat. We share a lot of interest in some of the things around race and sport and these kind of things. And your campus has been in the national spotlight quite a bit lately. And I'm hoping we can have a conversation and talk about some of this, especially from your perspective and some of your research as well.
All right, absolutely. Looking forward to it.
So maybe you could set the stage a little bit. What's been going on at the University of Missouri this fall? Some folks have been following it closely. Others, you're going to be giving them news a little bit out here too.
So we really have to start with last fall. When we come back from summer break, you had Michael Brown incident right there in St. Louis. Our students are generally, particularly our black students, are coming from St. Louis, from Kansas City to the west, from Chicago in the north. And then when you start to look at athletes, our black athletes are coming from Texas. You'll get a number from Texas and Dallas and Houston, and you'll get some from Florida. So some of these more southern states. So Ferguson really hit the core, part of our core group of students hard. So they come back from the summer and they're feeling still this grief of knowing that a young black male has been shot. Trayvon Martin is still something that has made an impact and something that they're feeling. Our students were going back on weekends to be a part of marches and protests. Some faculty were going. I went back for an evening, went and saw different colleagues from around the country who would come in and talk. So really that was a touchstone moment. Some of our students started an organization, MU for Michael Brown. They staged regular, of course, peaceful talks on campus in the kind of common squares. They would do different kinds of protests to talk about police violence and brutality. And then it quickly changed with administration trying to respond to this. We had our new chancellor aboard and Chancellor Lofton. And he really kind of was interested in why students seemed to be so persistent. So it wasn't the typical protest for a week or so. I mean, they were pretty strong in their protest for a good several, 3 to 4 months. And it drew enough attention that the chancellor said, well, why don't we have a town hall meeting to discuss this? So they had this huge meeting, and in it, students talked about how this resonated with them because they are still experiencing racism on our very own campus. So the chancellor was moved by that and said, well, let's take a look. So create some more town hall meetings. Faculty Council came out with a report that showed that black faculty were less satisfied with their experience by about 20% than white faculty. So even Faculty Council said that they wanted to address it. And so a newspaper article right after this first town hall meeting, the head of Faculty Council and the chancellor came out and said, we knew that racism still existed, but we didn't realize to what extent, and that our students were experiencing this in an everyday kind of fashion. And so here they had this awakening, right? That not only is it alive and well, but that students feel that they are experiencing this every day. And that really touched them, right? So when you think about a relationship and you talk about a serious problem and you get the person who really feels hurt to open up, they become vulnerable, right? And so the only thing that they're looking for is either just understanding or understanding and some solutions. How do we move forward? Well, when the chancellor said that he wanted to solve this race problem, which is what he said, the students felt like, okay, well, maybe we can trust this, even though they've been dealing with these everyday slights before Michael Brown, right? Maybe this is a moment where a new chancellor comes in and really wants to address it, and maybe we can trust this. So more town hall meetings, the promise of reports, the promise of action. Well, after a while, the students started to feel like this was hollow. So I have individual students who had their one-on-one meetings with the chancellor and left those meetings saying, I don't think he understands this at all. He's trying to equate some experience that he had as a white male in privilege and who's now a chancellor with my experience when I'm coming out of Chicago from a predominantly black you know, lower performing public school. I come in here. So they're saying he doesn't really get it. He thinks that somehow they're equatable and they're not. And then it seemed like the door started to close, not only in terms of we're moving closer to summer. And so there's a question of whether or not the chancellor is going to sweep it under the rug and hope that it goes away. But also the chancellor didn't seem so excited to hear from them anymore. He wasn't answering emails and calls. He wasn't as accessible towards the end of the year. So like good consumers of the academic marketplace, they decided that they would take it over his head, right? So you go to a restaurant, you're not happy with the service, you go to the server first, and then you decide you're going to go to the manager, and then you escalate it even more, and that's what they did. Well, there's always a counter movement, right? So while they started to do that, the counter movement was not only administration starting to resent this push by these students when they couldn't solve the problems very quickly, but you also had other students, black, white, Latino, Asian, it didn't matter. You had some students who felt like this is not what we're here for. We're here to get an education. These students are whining and complaining. They should just get over it. And so a counter movement starts. And when we get back this fall, you have an equal intensity of a counter movement by administration and by these students who feel bothered by the concerned students and the concerned students, right? You got that intensity and passion going on as well. And so what we started to see were more heated exchanges in open forums with students coming out against these concerned students. So before they might have just been passive and very few number and small instances where they come out and say, I don't believe those are real experiences. Now you're getting people actively saying, you all are just whining and complaining. You're getting in the way of my education. You're actually encroaching on my right to be educated. And when the administration did not respond quickly, right, they were kind of going on this with all deliberate speed, you know, as a lawyer, that with all deliberate speed, that famous talk from desegregation, it started to create even more hostility, because now I had students telling me that just going out on campus or nearby campus and to the social hotspots, they felt as if at nighttime when maybe some guys would be drunk, that they would get in the face of certain black students and actually try to provoke them. They felt, right? They might drop an N-bomb, right? They were doing things and they felt like there was more physical threats going on. And so students were now saying, not only is it that our experiences have been heard, but they're not being validated, the administration is not moving, but now we actually feel threatened by what's going on around campus. And so you get 3 to 5 high-profile incidents, including with the student body president, you know, being called, you know, the N-bomb dropping there, dropping the N-bomb where black students are rehearsing for homecoming, a homecoming event, and a student comes into the student union where they are rehearsing and starts dropping racial slurs. So it's really an encroaching. I mean, again, this is getting more and more intense. And so when administration doesn't respond, one, it allows those who are a part of this counter movement to feel even more bold in their coming out against the movement, but you get the humiliation and the greater feeling of you know, being disrespected that's going on by this concerned movement. And so they start to splinter because they're taking these different approaches. Some people are fed up. They want to take this to the national news. You know, they really want things to happen now. They're not willing to work with the system. And so that blows up to the point of students standing in front of the president's car at homecoming to protest, right? Because he has not been responsive anymore. He started out responsive just like the chancellor, and then he started to close his doors, started to close his ears, it seemed. And when his car, the engine is revving, and they have this on YouTube clips, it's kind of a famous clip now, the driver is revving his engine, right? The president is looking away, kind of aloof, as though he doesn't see the students. And so that scene of disrespect for these students, our bodies don't even matter, right? Just echoed the whole movement of Black Lives Matter. right? He doesn't even see us. And so Jonathan Butler, one student, decides he's going to put his life on the line because if you say my life doesn't matter, we're going to see. I'm going to take it out to the world and see if my life matters. If by putting my life on the line, I can make some real change. And so, you know, you're talking about that as a primary movement. But Josh, we also had at the beginning of fall, right before classes start, the president decides that he's going to take away graduate student health care. So there was a protest right before school starts about these kind of politics. Suppose, you know, there's stories about where his politics fit and that this was really about cronyism and so on, you know, taking away health care, taking away Planned Parenthood in conjunction with taking away or threatening to take away health care. After enough protest, the president says we'll reinstate it for this year, but I'm not guaranteeing next year. So, you know, there's all of these problems that are brewing, and we just finished a $75 million renovation of the football stadium. So you get slashing the academic budgets, graduate students that are helping us to teach, we're taking away their health care that makes us less competitive, makes less grad students available or who want to come because the funding is so terrible, and yet we're putting $75 million in a stadium renovation. I mean, there's a lot of problems going on. And so the concerned student movement is really much more than a black or white issue. It is a bunch of these issues pulled together, right, under this banner of this administration we have no confidence in, right? So that's what students started to put out. We have no confidence in this. Now, you know, they went back to 1969, a Legion of Black Collegians, and the demands that they made when the administration had said, we're failing, how can we help? And they found that they had the same issues going on back in 1969, right? This is where they started with their list of demands. Let's go back there and look for what the issues were. Oh, wow, we still don't have faculty of color in a significant percentage. Oh, wow, we still don't have representation in terms of counseling and mental health for women, you know, for LGBTQ. So they looked at these things and said, they've been sleeping at the wheel for a long time. This is not a new thing. And so the administration ran out of time because the relationship deteriorated. It went from hope, here are concerns, maybe you're sincere, maybe you're going to help, to now you seem to be ducking and dodging. Now I feel like you're betraying me, you're disrespectful, you're telling me I just have to continue to wait. Well, how long will I have to wait? To now our lives don't matter because there's physical threats and you're not even ensuring basic safety. And now your car, the president's car, actually bumped people, Josh. It actually bumped the students who were in front. And they're saying, so it's not just that we have to deal with maybe students who are ignorant and calling us out and calling us, you know, using racial slurs, but even the very president of the system is okay with his driver moving us out of the way. So that's how the whole thing kind of plays out. And ultimately what you see is black athletes, I explained, you know, when you look at the trajectory of black athletes and their politics, their activism, we were at a new stage. So you had the whole, I called them the crossover jock, used to call them the Cosby jock, right? The beginning of Dr. J, going on to Magic Johnson, to Michael Jordan, of course, Jordan and his famous Republicans buy sneakers too, right? This whole apoliticalness that it took to be a brand. Then you get the thug jock, right? The Allen Iverson and Ron Artest, who many of us respect, and you know, as scholars, because at least there is a standing up for yourself. You know, Latrell Sprewell crossed the line, but he stood up for himself being a man. He talked about the PJ Carlissimos of the world just yelling and screaming and calling them boy, right? Larry Johnson says it's like still being on a plantation. And Allen Iverson in his whole practice talk is saying, you know, you all don't understand that my life is bigger than just this team. You know, how does a franchise player, the MVP of the league, in 1 year start to have trade talks. When I led this team to an impossible, championship, and I'm getting taken to the cleaners for practice. And he said, and I put my heart on the floor. My best friend just died. I got these real life issues, and I got to talk to you all about practice, And he's trying to, change the narrative, change the way that the media see him. We know that they still haven't. He never got control of that, right? We still talk about this practice thing. But what he's really calling for is, I'm a human being with feelings. How am I supposed to feel when I take you to the championship in 1 year and I'm MVP, and the next year I'm being dogged, by the media, by my coach, right? As though I really don't care about my teammates, as though I'm a slacker. And so you get that, you get Ron Artest, who one of my interpretations is Ron Artest went off when a beer is thrown at him and he's treated like the animal in the zoo. That you kind of just tease, you throw things at him, you laugh at him, oh, the king of the jungle, and look at him. And Ron Artest's move was to say, you can't treat me like an animal in the zoo and just throw a beer at me because you don't like who I am on this court. I'm a human being, right? He was already chilled out. He was laying on top of the scorer's table. And so I see that activism, although it's often been, painted as these guys are deviant, when you look at what LeBron James picked up on and the Miami Heat with the way they wore the hoodies for Trayvon Martin, then you look at the protest last year for hands up by the St. Louis Rams. Then you look at the Cleveland kid that LeBron then goes and does another kind of protest, wears a T-shirt when the Cleveland kid is shot. You look at the various protests, whether it was Eric Garner after he got shot in New York, the various athletes, and of course the way the Clippers responded after Donald Sterling's comments and the whole question of whether or not they play their game. This activism has come back in vogue. And so I look at these collegiate athletes and they have a model for how you can protest. They have social media at their disposal so they can somewhat control the way that it's told, the story, the narrative. And so you put these things in place, right? Role models that they can admire that don't seem to get punished harshly for their protests, right? You've got the social media where you get to control this narrative a little bit. And then I also think that when Jonathan Butler put his life on the line, that could resonate with these alpha males, right? The gladiator talk that we have and militaristic talk that we have in big time football, where they talk about going into their lives are on the line, right? We're always putting our kind of lives on the line because of the real threat of physical damage and violence to our body, the concussions, the breaks, all of that. And I think that they looked at what Jonathan Butler did and they could say, you know what, he's one of us, right? This is a warrior, a soldier. And I think that spoke to them, right? It resonated. And then you get the hyper surveillance, the environment that the athletes are in now, where we have our graduate assistants following them to take attendance, right? To see if they're in their classes, where they're being watched at the training table. What are they eating? How much are they eating, right? They have to go for personal goals in the weight room, not simply because of performance, but because it helps other people's jobs. They're being pushed in these ways. All of this control, right, is enough to, quote unquote, make you want to holler, right? Makes you feel marginalized, isolated, alienated, like you're just a number. The amount of the frequency in which players are now relieved of their after 1 year of that contract, they're told you're not going to cut it here. The transferring that we're seeing, I think there's this growing dissatisfaction, right? The new revolt of the black athlete and athletes in general. We know the organizing that's going on around amateurism. There's all of this that's operating so that you get a perfect storm here, right? For these athletes to come out and say, things are not right in our campus. Things are not right in athletics. And we feel like we can take a stand and make a difference. Now, the sad part is we don't know that they're actually going to benefit. And I don't know what kind of list that they've come up with, if they've even really approached athletics. There are kind of rumors about their list of demands. But what we know is because the SEC and most big-time football programs hold on to that 1-year deal, right? You sign that contract on a yearly basis. We won't know what has really happened here until we get to the next set of roster, right? To that next roster. We know we've got a coach who has now stepped down, which makes more of these players lame ducks. There's going to be a new coach, new sheriff in town. We'll see if they really are happy with the fact, that these athletes have stood up, or whether that was really just the apparatus of the institution of athletics that says, let us smother this fire and say we're all on board and we stand by our athletes. If you've listened to Coach Pinkel's interviews, he's saying things like, I had to do it. He is adamant in saying it was not about concerned students 1950. In fact, he said, the person who does my tweets should not have put that hashtag there. This was not about those students. This was about my players. I've heard on Dave Zirin's XM Radio, he interviewed a big-time football coach who said, Coach had to do it because if not, he loses the locker room and he loses all recruits. So, it's an interesting thing that we've got going on. We don't know whether or not the black athletes really have won, although some people are trying to say that this is their power. I don't know that this is really going to show us that it's their power. It's going to show us the power of football, not necessarily the black athlete at the college level, because if they can just be moved, if they can be silenced, if the NFL doesn't draft them because they're called troublemakers, then they won't actually have empowered themselves. The football game has shown up, and what we already knew, those of us who studied sport, that it is way more than the front porch of the university anymore. It is key and central to the business of any of these major football schools. That's what is ranked clear, right? That you can get to a certain point where the board of curators or the board of regents or whomever will have to decide, do we go with the football program or the president? And they have said, we will go with the football program. That, I think, is clear, but everything else is still up in the air.
It's really fascinating hearing the timeline on it, because early on when you're telling the story, it's so clear there's optimism where you're engaging students in a meaningful way, it seems, early on, and there's opportunity to really understand what the concerns are and put a collaborative plan together to actually address those concerns. And then you can just predictably, as I'm listening to the story, you can see exactly where this is going to head in a horrible direction.
Exactly. Right.
I mean, even if I didn't know where it was going, I knew it was going to head in a really bad direction. And and now you're at this moment where you have another point in time where you've got a second chance for engagement.
Exactly.
And where do we go from here, right?
Yeah. And that's where understanding how institutions often work, right? That's what's scary for me, is thinking that what is more likely, what's easiest, is to go back to the status quo and just to retrench, right? So in speaking with Dr. Edwards, that's what he told me. He said, Scott, I think that what you should expect is a retrenchment and a recasting of the narrative. So we've got an email, right? We're getting letters from the president, the new interim president, the new interim chancellor, and they're saying things like, our students are passionate and this is great. Well, this is not what they were saying a week ago or a week and a half ago. The students were annoying. The students were asking for too much. They needed to, the last president was saying in April, right? He kept putting it off, and now it was in April. This is coming. Now it's our students are passionate. They're brilliant. They're smart. This is what makes us great. So this kind of reshaping this narrative, right? And the idea of the retrenchment, again, which kind of coach are we going to bring in? What is the approach going to be? How are these athletes going to be seen? Here, other places that they're trying to transfer, and of course in the NFL. We know how concerned professional sports are, that they are public image machines, that this is all about the image. How is this really going to play out, right? Are they going to take these kids, or what is the image now of a Missouri football player at this moment when it comes to the NFL? If I'm an owner, do I become concerned and think that maybe this kid is going to be willing to jump out there and just, take stands in all these different ways that could make me look bad, right? I think that that's a real valid concern. So I'm hopeful. I canceled classes last Tuesday, and I just opened up my door. I start with an 8 a.m. class anyway, but I was here from 8 to 2:30 straight. Of course, I had to offer extra credit, but I said, just come and talk to me. Let's just talk. Let's start. I said the struggle begins today. Now that we have this openness, this space, this opportunity, and Josh, to have students come in, they were expressing their different positions. I had one student who even talked about being a close friend to the kid who went into the Black homecoming rehearsal and said the racial slurs. He was emotionally moved at this moment. This is over a month from when it happened. And he said, I can't say that my friend did anything right in that moment. He said, I don't even know that guy who did that. I can't justify it. He said, but I'm telling you, he's not that bad. He's not a bad person, right? He was complaining about how the chancellor handled his friend. He felt like his friend didn't have due process. And there's a lot of people who are complaining that the chancellor didn't have due process, and neither did the president. Here is a young man saying his friend didn't, right? Even though it took a while for him to respond, which is what the concerned students were upset about. How long did it take you to respond? But you get all of these people are hurt. And so I am really hopeful that we move, and I'm thinking students, I keep telling the students, you all made this happen on both sides. And so it is time for you all to help us. You all have this media at your disposal. You all know more about this than we do. Education has to be a two-way process. The faculty has been reinvigorated. We're having teach-ins. Had one last night. Have another one tonight. Even in the face of death threats, faculty decided we should come into class. We wanted to walk with those grad students or students who felt unsafe, right? I head over to the Black Cultural Center. I stay in my office. I came to campus even when I usually don't, because I wanted to take a stand that we're not going to be bullied by outsiders who were starting to come in with these death threats. And so we're trying to rebuild, Josh. The faculty feels like we have more leverage to talk about how our teaching should be enhanced, that we have more leverage to say that funds need to be given to us to teach in ways that are going to, increase cultural awareness, that are hopefully where we can engage our students across perspectives, right? We want some changes. And we feel like now we have this leverage. We're now more invigorated with trying to hire faculty of diverse backgrounds. We're not just accepting. I felt like we had a complacency about us because funding was being halted. We didn't get our raises and so on. We were kind of just accepting this is the way that it was going. But now we're actually pushing back. We're coming up with what we want. We're making sure that we're speaking with these different student groups and trying to really push for a real shared governance. So these students have created this space. It wasn't simply about getting rid of people. It was much more about shared governance and saying, we don't believe that this leadership is really about helping all of us. And so that is the hope, that they don't retrench, that they aren't just casting this narrative to get us back to this status quo, but in reality, there's going to be a movement to make Mizzou better, right? That's the hope.
And do you have a couple more minutes? I know we're running into the end of your time, but so, just to add a couple bits of hope here on this. So coming from not your campus, right? Coming from Oregon and seeing the impact of what you've had going on the campus where I spent time as well has been really fascinating. And in particular, when I first started teaching there 6 years ago, and I teach a bit through the lens of race as well, I would ask the question, how much of an issue is race? in your lives. And almost to a person 6 years ago, people said that's been solved.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I was shocked because that wasn't what I was seeing.
Right.
I was seeing lots of marginalized students on campus that other people weren't seeing.
Yeah.
And now, in the last week, in the aftermath of everything you've got going on, there's been a very proactive approach at Oregon to have really meaningful conversation throughout the campus in a way I've never seen in the last half decade.
That's great. Yeah.
And so that's a very optimistic, pull from it that extends way beyond Mizzou and what you guys have going on there as well.
Yeah, it's been great to hear. I've got colleagues at other places where they've shared that with me. I've been asked to come in and give a talk to my old school, the University of California, Riverside, where I was teaching. The athletic director contacted me and said, hey, can you give us a little bit of insight on what has happened so that we can avoid this? We don't want this to happen here. And so they're asking me to come out and give a talk about, what I've seen. I want to leave you with one small anecdote, right? So when I first got here, fall 2012, teaching a class on, it's the Introduction to Black Studies, have about 3 or so football players. Both of them played a good bit. One ended up being dismissed. Just was a kid who was troubled, and he had some family stuff going on, and he wasn't fully focused here, and it really kind of hurt him. So he ended up having to go home. The other kid was a more prominent player, very bright kid, and I had them do a project, and I always have my students do some kind of study in groups. And so they were to go and do a campus study of Black lives here at Mizzou. And so one of the components was to do an observation of some activity. I felt like they were dragging their feet, didn't quite understand what I meant. How do you go and watch? What are we watching for, and so on. So I said, let's go over to the student union and let's do a brief observation, and then we'll talk. So we go and we head out. Our student union has a Starbucks, has some small little eatery place where you get sandwiches. Then it's pretty wide open, 2 big rooms for seating, some with some couches and so on. Pretty full generally. This was I want to say it was a 9:30 class, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So the students go in, because some of them aren't happy about doing it, they go in groups of 4 and 5, which of course, when you go and try to find seats or whatever, it's going to be disruptive. You're going to get a different experience. But I watch them. And after about 15 minutes, I go outside, tell them to come on outside, and we start to talk. Well, one of the football players tells me that he's upset. He didn't like that they had to do this. And I said, well, what do you mean? What happened? And he said, well, I felt like we were inner city kids on a field trip. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, here you get all these black kids, right? We're all the little black kids, and you put us right there in the student union, and people are looking at us like we don't belong. And I said, so tell me what exactly happened. He said, well, some girl gets up and walks away. She leaves when we come in. Others were pulling their tables. They were connecting 2 tables so that, we couldn't sit next to them. They wanted more space. He said people are grabbing their bags. He said it just, it was a mess. And I really didn't like how it made me feel. And I said, and so you're upset with me? He said, and he kind of just looked at me. And I asked some students, did you all have the same experience? They said, yes. I said, is this new to you? Are you surprised that you'd have this in our student union? And, a good number said, no, I ain't surprised. I mean, that's kind of how it goes. So I said to him, maybe you're getting a slice of life of a regular black student, not just a student athlete. I said, I'm okay with you having to feel this, because I find this interesting that just 2 days ago on Saturday, there's 50,000 plus cheering for you and your team when you make a play, when things happen. And here we are 2 days later on a Monday morning, and now you seem like a stranger, like a foreigner. I said, doesn't that strike you as odd? I said, you look like a football player right now. You've got the Mizzou Tiger sweatpants. You've got the dry fit shirt that says Mizzou football. I mean, it's not about just racial stereotypes, you got football gear on. So how is it that you should be such a stranger here? It's not like you just look like some random person off the street. You look like a football player and you're experiencing this. And so there is that bubble, right, that our athletics increasingly puts our kids in, right, our athletes. They're on the other side of our major boulevard, right, the athletic complex is, and the rigor in which they have to go about this athletic career, right, this real professionalism, the getting up, going to the athletic complex, doing a workout, eating there, going to classes, coming back, going to class or going to study, coming back for tutoring, coming back for practice, coming back for meeting with a trainer, coming back, to see a doctor. I mean, they have the total institution over there. It governs their lives. And yet, Dr. Edwards talked about this way back in the 80s. They're still this athlete. They're still separate, right? That this blackness can make you on one end novel, can make you a hero, but yet it can also create that distance for you, right? And so you're not quite a black student, and you're not quite, simply an athlete that everyone can embrace and think you're smart, this and that. You come with this extra baggage. And so, I think that our athletes have gained some of this awareness, right? So that when the Michael Brown incident happens, it disrupted that total athlete identity. That many of them were reminded, and they have easy cases because, the ESPN report had that we're number 2 in arrest and sexual assaults, right? And we know that if you take seriously this idea of driving while black, while we know that there's a lot of problems with how our athletes are promised sex and how that creates a hostile environment on campus, where there's much more sex being given to them, thrown to them, where even in the recruiting process, they're promised sex. We know about the University of Louisville case, right? This creates a lot of problems, and it makes it dangerous for a lot of young women on our campus, right? Because these athletes are, from the time they're being recruited, promised sex. But there's also this surveillance, again, that's going on, right? That there's tabs that are being kept on them, that they still are black athletes who get pulled over by police, right? That sometimes they're being told they're even being targeted. And so I think that the Michael Brown and the Eric Garner and the other cases disrupted them from being in that bubble totally and reminded them, but wait, for many of them, I'm still a black male and I still have to go through this. At the times where I'm not an athlete, I'm this black male who has a hoodie, I could be seen in these same ways. And so they had gotten used to just being the athlete, but this disruption that happened with all of the events in these inner cities helped to remind them. So that also allows us to connect, right? And so I think that that's a part of what we've got going on. That at this time in athletics, big time athletics, when you look at this increasing surveillance, this increasing professionalization, we're alienating these kids from the rest of this campus and not being able to fully enjoy it because they have to take sports so seriously. And while that may help them to become professionals, that small number, it also can create all these other kind of resentments and problems, right? And so if we're not careful, we're going to have more and more of these problems. Right? In some ways, we welcome it, right? We hope that athletes are pushing for their humanity. They're pushing back against this system that seems to be exploiting them more and more. But you also have those cases of when that fallout happens, the casualty of war, like I said, looking at this roster come July and August as they prepare for the next season, there's going to be a lot of casualties of war, Josh. And there's going to be a lot of these young men who had the hopes and dreams of getting a college education, right? Of course, they had that hoop dream or that pigskin dream too. But some of these guys are going to be back in their neighborhoods without an education. Many, I would argue, that as it's not, it won't have to take a protest. Coaches and athletic programs will be looking for their perhaps, bad seeds, their activists that might be there waiting. They're going to try to find ways to keep this from happening. And you're going to get more athletes who get, weeded out if they are seen as these bad seeds. So I'm a little bit worried, but I'm hopeful that the programs that have the right heart, that really are thinking about these things in the right ways, they will engage folks like you and I. They'll ask for help, right? Coaches will say, you know what, I need some help. I want to be better, right? And that they will really push for things like giving 4-year guaranteed scholarships. I mean, this for me is what athletes should be pushing for. If you get this window, you should say, you know what, I want to decide for myself if I stay or if I go. I want this education. That's the real revolutionary act. Get your education. And so that's what I'm hoping, is that there is this space for this opportunity for us to get better, you know. But this is the canary in the mines, right? The mine shaft, right? We've got this glimmer of there are some real problems still brewing, and hopefully we pay attention to that and we become more proactive and better at creating solutions.
I sure hope so, Scott. And I want to really, as we wrap, say that this is not the end of our conversation, but really the beginning. And
yes,
I really appreciate the work you do in this space, and let's keep at it together here.
Absolutely, Josh. Thanks.
All right, thanks. Be good, and we'll talk again soon.
All right, next time I won't talk as much.
Don't say that. You're holding out on me if you do that.
All right, talk to you soon.
Okay, be well.
All right.